Welcome to Compassion Over Silence. I'm your host, Rashida Saunders. Today we're talking about grief. Not just the grief that follows death, the grief that follows change, the grief that follows trauma, the grief that follows watching people you love struggle, the grief that follows relationships that change, and the grief that follows becoming someone's survival required. Because grief isn't always about losing a person. Sometimes it's about losing a future, a relationship, a sense of safety, or a version of yourself you thought would always be there. This is a space for honest conversations about leadership, healing, identity, service, and what happens when strength and humanity exist together, because carrying it all quietly comes at a cost. For a long time, I thought grief was something that happened after a funeral, something that followed death, something temporary, something you moved through and eventually left behind. I know differently now. Some of the deepest grief I've carried had nothing to do with death. I've grieved people who were still alive, relationships that changed, friendships that ended, dreams that never happened, versions of myself that never got the chance to exist. And the thing about grief is that it rarely announces itself. It doesn't knock. It doesn't ask if this is a good time. It doesn't care about your schedule, your responsibilities, or the fact that other people are depending on you. It simply arrives. Sometimes it arrives all at once. Other times it arrives years later. Sometimes it arrives disguised as exhaustion, as anger, as anxiety, as numbness, as loneliness, as the feeling that something is wrong even when you can't explain why. And often, we don't recognize it until it's been living inside us for a very long time. One of the hardest lessons I've learned is that grief is much bigger than loss. Grief is the emotional cost of caring deeply about something that changed. And whether we acknowledge it or not, grief leaves its fingerprints on all of us. Today, I want to talk about the grief we recognize, the grief we ignore, and the grief we carry long after everyone else thinks we should be okay. Because healing doesn't begin when grief disappears. Healing begins when we finally tell the truth about what hurts. I used to think grief was something obvious, something people could see, something that announced itself. But some of the deepest grief I've carried wasn't visible at all. There was no funeral, no memorial service, no cards, no flowers, no moment where the world stopped and acknowledged that something important had been lost. Some of my grief arrived through absence. Some arrived through disappointment. Some arrived through watching people I love struggle. Some through realizing life wasn't going to unfold the way I imagined. I think about my brother. I think about what incarceration does to families. Not just the person serving the sentence, but everyone connected to them. The birthdays missed, the conversations missed, the ordinary moments that never happen, the constant awareness that someone you love is absent from your daily life. People don't always talk about that kind of grief, but it's real. I think about relationships that changed, people I thought would always be part of my life, friendships that slowly drifted apart, connections that ended without a dramatic event, just distance, time, life. One day you realize someone who once knew everything about you now knows almost nothing, and that's a loss too. I think about dreams I had for my life, plans that didn't happen, versions of the future I was certain would exist. The older I get, the more I realize that grief isn't always about losing what was. Sometimes it's about losing what could have been, and maybe the hardest grief of all was recognizing how much of myself I sacrificed in order to survive. The hypervigilance, the self protection, the independence, the armor. For most of my life, I saw those things as strengths, and in many ways they were. They helped me survive. But eventually, I had to acknowledge the cost. I wasn't just grieving experiences, I was grieving pieces of myself. The trusting version, the softer version, the version that believed life would be different, the version that hadn't learned to brace for impact. That's the thing nobody told me about grief. Sometimes grief isn't about losing a person. Sometimes it's about mourning the person you had to become. About a year ago, grief arrived at my door in a way I never could have anticipated. My niece Reminisce passed away. She died just before her first birthday. Even now, saying those words feels difficult, because some losses never quite make sense. Some losses never feel fair. Some losses leave questions that don't have answers. I remember the shock, the disbelief, the feeling that life had suddenly divided itself into two chapters, before and after. But grief didn't arrive alone. At the same time, my family was mourning the loss of one child. Another child needed us. My niece, me, came into my care, and suddenly I found myself holding two realities at once: grief and responsibility, heartbreak and purpose, loss and love. There wasn't time to stop. There wasn't time to fall apart. There were appointments, court hearings, paperwork, schedules, bedtimes, meals, a little girl who needed stability, a little girl who needed safety, a little girl who needed someone to keep showing up. So I did what I've done much of my life. I kept moving. I handled what needed to be handled. I focused on the next task, the next appointment, the next responsibility. And for a while, that worked. At least it looked like it did. But grief is patient. It waits. And eventually it asks to be acknowledged. What I've learned over the past year is that grief and gratitude can exist together. I can be grateful that I Am Me is with us, and still grieve, reminisce. I can find joy in watching a child grow, and still feel sadness about who isn't here to see it. I can celebrate milestones, and still feel the ache of absence. Those things don't cancel each other out, they coexist. That's what grief taught me. It taught me that healing isn't choosing between joy and sorrow. It's learning how to hold both at the same time. And some days that's harder than people realize. One of the things nobody tells you about grief is that it doesn't always arrive on the hardest day. Sometimes it arrives months later. Sometimes it shows up in an ordinary moment when your guard is down. I remember watching I Am Me reach a milestone, a moment that should have been filled entirely with joy. And it was. I still remember her first step, those wobbly, determined movements as she made her way forward. Everyone around her was excited. We cheered, smiled, and celebrated the kind of moment families wait for. It was one of those memories you want to hold on to forever, a reminder of growth, resilience, and new beginnings. But alongside that joy was something else, a sadness I couldn't ignore, because every milestone carried a reminder that there were supposed to be two little girls, two personalities, two voices, two futures unfolding side by side. Instead, there was an empty space, a space no amount of love could fill. I remember smiling and celebrating the moment, and then later sitting alone with the realization that grief had been traveling alongside me the entire time, not because I wasn't grateful, not because I wasn't healing, but because love doesn't disappear when someone does. That's when I realized grief wasn't something I needed to get over. It was something I needed to learn how to carry. And carrying it required acknowledging it. What I didn't realize at the time was that this wasn't the first grief I had carried. It was simply the one I could no longer ignore. When I look back on my life, I can see grief woven throughout it, not just in loss, in change, in disappointment, in trauma, in the quiet ways life asks us to let go of things we never expected to lose. I think about my brother. I think about the impact incarceration has on families. The birthdays missed, the conversations missed, the ordinary moments that never happened. I think about loving someone deeply while grieving circumstances you cannot change. There is a helplessness that comes with that, a sadness, an anger, a hope that never completely leaves. People don't always recognize that as grief, but it is. Looking back, I realized some of my grief started long before I had language for it, long before law enforcement, long before adulthood, long before I understood words like trauma, healing, or emotional wellness. It started in childhood. It started in a home where survival often took priority over softness, where responsibilities arrived early, where food insecurity shaped decisions, where I learned how to pay attention to what was missing. At the time, I didn't recognize any of it as grief. I thought it was normal. I thought everyone worried about the things I worried about. I thought everyone learned how to be strong before they learned how to feel safe. I thought everyone was constantly preparing for what might go wrong next. It wasn't until therapy that I realized I wasn't just healing from individual experiences. I was grieving a childhood that often required survival, grieving the years spent carrying responsibilities that felt bigger than my age, grieving the version of myself that learned how to be responsible before she learned how to be carefree. And maybe that's why grief can be so difficult to recognize. Sometimes we're grieving things that happened. Sometimes we're grieving things that never happened. The safety we needed, the support we deserved, the softness we didn't experience, the childhood we never fully got to have. And whether we realize it or not, those losses often follow us into adulthood. And then there is the grief that comes from experiences that change you, experiences that divide your life into before and after. There was a time in my career when I believed I could leave work at work. I believed I could respond to difficult calls, do my job, and move on. I know now that it doesn't work that way. There are calls that stay with you, faces you remember, conversations you replay, moments that quietly become part of your story. Years ago, I responded to a homicide call involving a 17-year-old. I won't share the details because they aren't mine to tell, but I remember standing there and being struck by the reality that someone's child wasn't coming home. A teenager, a young person with an entire life ahead of them, dreams, plans, people who loved them. In law enforcement, we're trained to focus on the work that needs to be done: secure the scene, conduct the investigation, complete the reports, follow the process. And all of that matters, but beneath the procedures is a human reality that can be hard to shake. I remember thinking about the family. I remember wondering what that phone call must have felt like. I remember thinking about the empty seat at the dinner table, the bedroom that would remain untouched, the milestones that would never come. Long after that call ended, parts of it stayed with me, not because I knew that young man personally, but because grief has a way of reaching beyond the people we know. Sometimes grief comes from witnessing someone else's loss. Sometimes it comes from being reminded how fragile life really is. That experience taught me something important. We often think grief belongs only to family members and close friends, but grief can also live in the hearts of teachers, neighbors, first responders, and complete strangers whose lives briefly intersect with tragedy. Sometimes grief is simply the human response to recognizing that something precious has been lost. The emotional weight, the realization that life can change in an instant. I continued showing up, I continued working, I continued doing what was expected of me. From the outside, I looked fine, but something inside me had shifted. I remember sitting alone in my car after one shift, staring through the windshield long after I should have gone home. The reports were finished, the call was over, life had moved on, but I hadn't. I couldn't explain it at the time. I only knew that something felt different. Something felt heavier. What I understand now is that grief doesn't only follow death. Sometimes it follows the loss of certainty, the loss of innocence, the loss of the belief that difficult things happen somewhere else, to someone else. What I didn't understand at the time was that I was grieving. Grieving a sense of certainty, grieving a version of myself that believed difficult things happen to other people, grieving the emotional innocence that existed before that experience. Nobody teaches you how to process that kind of loss, especially in professions built around competence and composure. You learn how to respond, you learn how to perform, you learn how to keep moving. And so that's what I did. I kept moving until therapy helped me realize that moving forward and healing are not the same thing. Healing required something different. It required honesty. It required acknowledging that experiences leave fingerprints. That trauma changes us. That grief isn't limited to death. Sometimes grief is the recognition that an experience altered the way you see yourself, other people, and the world around you. And sometimes healing begins the moment we stop pretending otherwise. I thought grief was about what I had lost: the people, the relationships, the opportunities, the moments I could never get back. But therapy helped me recognize another kind of grief, a quieter kind, a grief that had been following me for years. I wasn't just grieving what had happened to me, I was grieving who I had to become to survive it. I think that's true for a lot of people. When life gets difficult, we adapt. We become stronger, more independent, more self reliant, more guarded, more productive, more prepared. Those adaptations help us survive. They help us keep moving. They help us function. But every adaptation comes with a cost. For years, I celebrated my independence. I was proud of the fact that I could handle difficult things. I was proud of my resilience. I was proud of my ability to keep going when life became overwhelming. And I should be. Those qualities carried me through some very difficult seasons. But eventually, I had to acknowledge something. The woman who survived wasn't always the woman I wanted to be. Survival had taught me to stay vigilant, to stay prepared, to stay in control, to expect disappointment, to carry things alone, to trust myself more than anyone else. Those lessons protected me, but they also isolated me. They made it harder to ask for help, harder to receive support, harder to trust, harder to rest, harder to believe that I didn't have to earn my worth through performance. And when I began healing, I realized I wasn't just mourning losses. I was mourning the years I spent carrying everything by myself. I was mourning the softness I had buried. I was mourning the version of myself that learned to brace for impact before she learned to feel safe. That's a difficult realization because survival often gets rewarded. People praise your strength, your resilience, your ability to keep going. What they don't always see is the cost, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the hypervigilance, the constant feeling that you have to hold everything together. I know that feeling. I've lived it. And one of the most emotional parts of healing wasn't remembering what happened. It was realizing how much energy I had spent protecting myself from what happened. Because grief wasn't only attached to the losses, it was attached to the life I built around those losses: the armor, the walls, the distance, the constant need to be okay. The version of me that believed survival was the same thing as living. It isn't. And maybe that's what grief was trying to teach me all along. Not that I was broken, not that I was weak, not that I had failed, but that some parts of me deserved acknowledgement. Some parts deserved compassion. Some parts deserved rest. And some parts deserved permission to stop carrying everything alone. As I reflect on my own journey, I realize that grief has touched almost every chapter of my life. The loss of people I loved, relationships that changed, dreams that never happened, experiences that changed me, versions of myself I had to leave behind. For years, I thought healing meant moving on. Now I think healing means carrying things differently, not pretending things never happened, not minimizing their impact, not allowing them to define the entire story, just carrying them with more honesty. Because grief isn't a sign that we're broken, it's a sign that something mattered. Someone mattered, a relationship mattered, a dream mattered, a season of life mattered. Today, I still carry grief. I suspect I always will, but I no longer see it as something that needs to be fixed. I see it as evidence that I cared, evidence that I loved, evidence that something meaningful existed. This week, I want you to reflect on this question. What loss have you been carrying quietly that deserves acknowledgement? Not fixing, not solving, simply acknowledging. Because sometimes healing begins the moment we stop pretending we're okay. Until next time, remember, grief doesn't mean you're broken, it means you loved. And that matters too. If this conversation resonated with you, follow the podcast, leave a review, and share it with someone who may need it. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other. Leadership, humanity, honest conversations.